In the heart of Italy, there is a city that contains all the aspects of human accomplishment in the world of art and culture. A city called Florence. No other city in Italy ever had such an intense flowering of art. No other city had such a grouping together of artistic geniuses. The Ponte Vecchio, so easily recognizable, is considered the unofficial representative of the city. We know Florence from three main landmarks: the Ponte Vecchio, the Duomo with its red cupola, and the Palazzo della Signoria. This old palace is the essence of the Italian Renaissance. And just down the street is an outdoor cafe specializing in fresh fruit concoctions served in huge glasses. A young couple from Toronto, Canada, wash down their fresh pastry with fresh squeezed lemonade. The fresh fruit sits quietly waiting its turn. The Palazzo della Signoria is commonly known as the Old Palace, the Palazzo Vecchio. Where did they get the idea for the architecture for this imposing building? Well, they got it from a little hill town 32 miles from Florence called Poppi. P-O-P-P-I, Poppi. The Counts Guidi that owned all this real estate out here in the valley of the Casentino wanted a palace that could also serve as a fortress. So they commissioned a young architect named Arnolfo di Cambio to design it for them. Arnolfo di Cambio was a young architect who was trained by the Cistercian monks who specialized in architecture. He is also known to have designed the Duomo of Florence and the Church of Santa Croce. The city fathers of Florence, the Signoria, were to commission Arnolfo to give them the same design for Florence. So here it is, the Palazzo della Signoria. The clock in the palace doesn't work anymore, so don't rely on it, but it did work until just a few years ago. Just underneath the battlements are the different emblems of the merchant guilds, the Signoria. The red lily on the shield is the symbol of Florence. The Marzocco is the heraldic symbol of Florence, a lion holding a shield with the red lily. Here's a copy of the original by Donatello. Neptune, the god of the sea, stands here surrounded by nymphs and fauns. It is regarded as less than a perfect sculpture. Every time Michelangelo passed near the Neptune, he's supposed to have said, "Amanati, what a beautiful marble you have spoiled." The Florentines mockingly call it Il Biancone, the white thing. Also by Donatello is Judith slaying the tyrant Holofernes. The little Jewish princess is warning to any potential tyrant, "Don't you dare take away our independence, we'll gladly cut off your head." Well, speaking of tyrants, here he is, the tyrant most Florentines happily tolerated, Cosimo I, from the younger branch of the Medici family. He gave Florence 39 years of prosperity. He had a police department that put down all crime. He was ruthless to his enemies and pardoned no one that was foolish enough to turn against him. Ruthless, yes, but he revived the silk and woolen trades and turned out to be the most energetic ruler Florence had ever known. He lived in the same period as Michelangelo in the 1500s. A masterpiece in bronze, Perseus by Benvenuto Cellini, with a satanic head of Medusa. Hercules slaying Cacus. Hercules, the son of Zeus, was the strongest man alive, worshipped by ancient peoples both as a mortal hero and as an Olympian deity. Owing to the influence of Greek colonies, the worship of Hercules was widely diffused among the Italian tribes. The Rape of Polixena by Pio Fedi, done in 1866. His pupil, Bertoldi, created the Statue of Liberty for the Americans. Rape of the Sabine by Gianbologna in 1583 under the Medici Grand Duke Francesco I. Notice the spiral effect of the figures. This work had such tremendous influence on the other artists of the post-Renaissance that even the great Bernini fell under its spell. No one seems to go hungry in this piazza. No one. One of the most popular cafes on the Piazza della Signoria is the Revoir. This cafe specializes in chocolate, which they send all over the world. People can be seen sitting here scooping into pure chocolate served in large glasses. Cappuccino comes to us from the Capuchin monks who had hoods, cappuccio. The hood for the coffee is the white milky froth, a delicious taste. But remember to stop after 1 cup, otherwise you're awake for a week. The Piazza della Signoria is the most popular of the 3 main piazzas in Florence. It is here in this piazza where the young Michelangelo played as a boy that we turn to his art and his life. This is the story of one of the most amazing sculptors that ever lived, Michelangelo Buonarroti. Two gentlemen view the David. He tells his friend, "Did you know that Michelangelo did the David when he was 27 years of age in 3 months of working time? Did he make the right hand oversized to attach it to the leg as a brace for the heavy arm? He did the David from a defective block of marble that was rejected by all the other sculptors of Florence. He worked right around a huge crack to create the epitome of the male physical form." The two friends are on their way to see the original David in the Accademia, which is about a 30-minute walk from the Piazza della Signoria. Without noticing, they pass by a carving on the side of the Palazzo Vecchio. It is told that Michelangelo and his friends were doing bits of art as graffiti. Michelangelo did this blindfolded. Inside the Accademia, in the rotunda, stands the original David. David is circling the giant, studying his opponent, getting ready to make a decision, to strike for freedom, and become much more than a humble shepherd prince. He will become king of the Hebrews, and eventually the father of King Solomon. David lived 1,000 years before Jesus Christ. A humble shepherd quietly watches as we make our way to the birthplace of Michelangelo. His mother fell from a horse on this road just before he was born. His father, Lodovico Buonarroti, was to be the temporary mayor of the hamlet of Caprese, the first job he ever had, and he was 31 years of age. The old house is still standing, with every stone still in place. A few sculptures from modern-day artists decorate the grounds. Michelangelo was born in 1475 and died in 1564. He had a very long life, but a life totally devoted to his work. He never traveled further north than Venice or further south than Rome. Well, what did he look like? Can you remember the face of Michelangelo? We see in this self-portrait the face of a pugilist. His nose was crushed by a jealous student when they were both working in the garden of San Marco. His name was Torrigiano, and he boasted to his friends, "Now Michelangelo will carry my signature to his grave." And he did, with that poor disfigured nose. When he was 6 months of age, the family moved back to their farm in the village of Settignano on the hills above Florence. They owned a small farm here in this village that had been in the Buonarroti family for over 300 years. It was in Settignano that his mother was to pass away when Michelangelo was 6 years old. When he was 7, they moved into this house in Florence on the Via de' Benticordi. The house is in good condition, and people still live in it. In fact, it's in better condition today than it was when the 5 brothers, their father, and the old grandmother moved in. His friend Granacci would introduce Michelangelo to the great master Ghirlandaio. They would walk the Via Ghibellina on their way to the bodega of Ghirlandaio, and Michelangelo very quickly impressed the master by doing some drawings that moved the great teacher to allow Michelangelo to work as an apprentice without having to pay. He was the only student ever to achieve this distinction. At the end of the street, the two boys passed the monastery, the Badia. Since the early 16th century, there's been a Madonna and child above the door in glazed terracotta. It was Luca della Robbia and his nephew Andrea and his son Giovanni that perfected the art of glazed terracotta. Granacci and Michelangelo turned and walked past the Bargello, the massive fortress built in 1255. For 200 years, the palace was the official residence of the Podestà, the governing magistrate of the city, who was traditionally a foreigner. It's on the Via del Proconsolo, which tells us that Florence is a city founded by the Romans under Julius Caesar in 59 BC. Under Cosimo I, this was a dreadful place for the prisoners from the Battle of Monte Merlo. In this courtyard, you would have heard the cries of agony as he first tortured and then executed all those who had opposed him, sparing no one. And most of those executed were his own friends from the other noble families of Florence. Today, it's the Museo Nazionale, the National Museum of Florence, famous for its collection of Florentine Renaissance sculpture. The works of Donatello are displayed in the vaulted hall called the Salone del Consiglio Generale. In the middle of the room is his Marzocco, the Florentine heraldic lion in Pietra Serena. You can see his bronze David in the background. The Donatello David is the earliest known nude freestanding statue in the round since antiquity. It was made for Cosimo the Elder and originally placed in the courtyard of the Medici Palace. He gave his David a Greek hat and a languid, victorious physical form. You will see the wing coming off the helmet of Goliath and riding up the inside of his leg. Here is the bronze David by Verrocchio, the student of Donatello and the teacher of Leonardo da Vinci. This David, in contrast to Donatello's version, is full of life and movement. From the Bargello, Michelangelo and Granacci would turn onto the Corso and continue their way to the Bodega of Ghirlandaio. They could look up through the buildings and see the old tower houses that were already there for 350 years. There was an edict in Florence that if you've profited off the city, you must live within the city walls for at least 6 months of the year. Well, they were known as the Society of Towers, medieval skyscrapers. The noble families moved in from their fortified castles and hill towns and built their tower houses for defense. They were at war with each other. They would run planks from one tower house to the next and scurry across like mice in the pantry. They loved to fight with each other almost as much as the ancient Greek city-states. Nobles against merchants, Guelphs against Ghibellines, popes against emperors, great family clans against other family clans. Struggles for political authority. This was the character of Florence for several centuries. The Medici Palace on the Via Larga was finished just 15 years before the birth of Michelangelo. And Michelangelo, oddly enough, was to be invited to live in this palace by the time he was 15. He was selected from the Bodega of Ghirlandaio to train under the finest teachers the Medici could find. Lorenzo the Magnificent was the patron of Michelangelo and liked him so much that he would have him sit right next to him for evening meals in the Medici Palace. Lorenzo was called Il Magnifico because he was such a diplomat. He would step off the curb and let an older man pass, and he was the richest man in Italy at that time. When he was 15, Michelangelo did the Madonna of the Steps, his first work in drapery. At 16, he did the Battle of the Centaurs, his first use of the male form, a confused mass of fighting bodies, a perfect theme to depict muscular male torsos in violent action. He would have been about 19 years old when he did this crucifix. The prior of the Church of Santo Spiritu allowed him to dissect the bodies in the church hospital to better learn anatomy. In return for the favor, he carved this wooden crucifix from white poplar and gave it to the prior. The prior had risked his own life for Michelangelo. It was the death penalty to dissect bodies. This crucifix has recently been found hanging in that same church hospital. His first Pietà has a certain resemblance to the crucifix. It is almost the same rendering of Jesus. This is the only work Michelangelo ever signed. He is now 24. When he was 27, he did the David, and its originality lies in the fact that this is David before the battle against the giant. Other Davids are depicted after the battle. At 29, he was commissioned to do a painting of the Holy Family. It was painted for Agnolo Doni, a wealthy wool merchant, who tried to pay only half of the agreed sum, whereupon Michelangelo charged him double the original price, which he eventually paid. From the age of 33 to 37, Michelangelo was to paint the entire ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican for Pope Julius II. Adam is reaching out for the life-giving touch from the hand of God. Here Eve is stepping out of the side of Adam, a painting showing how Michelangelo was inspired by the painter Masaccio, a painter of the early Florentine Renaissance. Michelangelo painted Hebrew prophets sitting on thrones, and for the first time in this chapel, Greco-Roman culture is joined to the Hebrew world. Here is a detail of the wall painting entitled The Judgment, which Michelangelo did 25 years after the ceiling. Another theme that he chose was the pagan Sibyls, who, like the prophets, foresaw the coming of Christ. She is profoundly touched by her inner experience. Part of the story of creation is this scene entitled The Creation of Sun, Moon, and Plants. God is hard at work, doing so much in just 7 days. He was commissioned to do 22 statues for the tomb of Julius II, and the only one he fully finished is of Moses, which is now decorating the Pope's tomb in the church St. Peter's in Chains in Rome. Michelangelo is now 42 years of age. A painting of Michelangelo, all dressed up to meet the Turkish Sultan. He is now 47 years of age when his friend Bugiardini did this portrait. The Sultan had asked him to come to Turkey and build him a bridge. Michelangelo was determined to go, but he never did. The Medici chapels are on Piazza di San Lorenzo. We find a vast market in this part of Florence that specializes in all kinds of bargains, especially in leather goods. One might be able to find inexpensive handbags here, but don't expect any guarantees on the workmanship. The facade of the Church of San Lorenzo remains unfinished to this day. Michelangelo was going to finish it, but as with many of his projects, he just never got around to it. Inside the Medici chapels, in a room called the New Sacristy, are the tombs for the 2 Medici princes, Lorenzo the Magnificent and his handsome younger brother, Giuliano de' Medici. Over the sarcophagus of Lorenzo the Magnificent, Michelangelo placed the figures of dusk, and opposite is dawn. Over his handsome brother, Giuliano de' Medici, the figure of night with symbol of night, the owl, and opposite is day, a figure turning away and staring blankly with eyes unseeing, dead, all figures without carved pupils. A slave struggling to free himself from the marble, unfinished and yet meant to be a corner figure for the tomb of Julius II. Early in his life, Michelangelo began supporting his family of 4 brothers as well as his father. He was an introvert and had the habit of eating very little, especially while working. His mother, Francesca, died when he was 6 years old, which could have led to his melancholy character. Not very many people could claim to know him. While he was in Rome, at the age of 64, he did the Brutus, the assassin of Julius Caesar. The Pietà in Florence was done when he was 80 years old, and the central figure of Nicodemus helping Jesus from the cross is said to be a self-portrait of Michelangelo. Take one more look at his face. As he was working, he suddenly went into a rage and tried to destroy it with a hammer. Fortunately, one of his students stopped him just in time. The Rondinini Pietà was his last work of art. He was working on it until just a few days before his death. Before he lost consciousness, his last words were for his friend, Tommaso de' Cavalieri. "I want to be buried in Santa Croce with my family." Tommaso replied, "The Pope wants you buried in your own church, St. Peter's." Michelangelo answers, "St. Peter's is not my home. Promise you will take me back to Florence." He was just 2 weeks short of his 90th birthday when he died. Inside of the Church of Santa Croce, where the monks once lived, These boys now work. The story goes back to after World War II, when there was so much poverty in Italy. Entrepreneurs had to come up with creative ideas to put people to work. They took the poorest youngsters off the streets of Florence and gave them the opportunity of working with master craftsmen. It was his idea, a man named Marcello Gori. He told them they could work for him forever if they wished, or even go off and work for his competition. He didn't mind as long as they worked. The master craftsman lay down the gold leaf using a natural glue. It's made of egg white, milk, and olive oil. The bronze tools are fired up to a certain temperature, and the design is rolled onto the leather. Here the master applies the trim to the jewel box. They then rub it off with a cotton cloth, probably the most valuable piece of throwaway cotton you'll ever see. They burn it to get their gold back out of it. When you think of leather and gold, you think of Florence. Where this youngster now frolics, the young Michelangelo once played. He grew up right here. This is his neighborhood. And he's home in the Church of Santa Croce. On the Piazza of Santa Croce are the 14th century palaces. Here the Piccolomini palaces, where the ground floor was for the horses. Now they are the shops, and she works in one. She knows all about gold and speaks fluent English because she's an art student from Denver, Colorado. She works at Mario's Gold Market. Mario used to be a tour leader taking people all over the world. He saw a need in Florence for a gold market where people could browse forever and not feel intimidated to buy. He started with one goldsmith, and now he has 4. He started with 3 salesgirls, and now he has 9, mostly art students from foreign countries. The old tools date back to the 13th century. The lubrication has a secret formula, only known to this particular goldsmith. Mario wanted you to see the latest gold rings, so he brought them out onto Piazza Santa Croce for your inspection. Remember, you don't have to buy at Mario's Gold Market. The goldsmiths replaced the butchers on the Ponte Vecchio, and the bridge has been awarded the distinction, the shopping center of the Renaissance. Here with a bust of the great goldsmith Benvenuto Cellini in the background, the young street craftsmen sell their art. Young artists arrive in Florence to perfect their craft and hone their skills. A sketch, a drawing, a watercolor, a painting. You can see the work created before your eyes. The young artists find a ready market for their work in the streets of Florence. When the Medici Duke moved the butchers off the bridge, he replaced them with goldsmiths and silversmiths. Silver by Brandi Marti. Brandi Marti was a miner in the mountains of Italy, mining silver, when one day he came up with the idea, why should I spend the rest of my life in the mine when I come from the city known for the promissory note? I'll go home, get a loan, and go into business. Well, he did, and this is it. He's constantly flitting from one silversmith to the next, checking their work for perfection. He's a humble man, totally devoted to his business. Silver by Brandi Marti. Ah, the wonder of that magic bridge. It represents the style of the Florentine Renaissance and serves as a spokesman for the shops that have lined its avenue since the 14th century. Although the Florentine regard themselves as so different from other Italians and other regions, one thing they have in common, without argument, is their love of children. Look at them closely. You've seen these faces before, in the paintings of Michelangelo, Masaccio, and Raphael. The parks in Florence are havens from modern life, beautiful oases. You will see the Florentines on Sundays window shopping on the Via Tornabuoni, and when they disappear from the streets of Florence, you find them in the cascine. The parents enjoying the shade, the youngsters involved with physical freedom, moving their little bodies with excitement that's reserved for the very young. San Miniato, built in 1018. It's the prototype for all the other churches in Italy built with this style, white and green marble, linear architecture. You see it in the Cathedral of Pisa, Siena, Orvieto, and many more. When Michelangelo was engaged in improving the defenses of Florence, he wrapped that tower to the left of San Miniato in mattresses to protect it from the cannonballs of the returning Medici troops. Between Florence and Siena, we have Chianti country. One must take advantage of the hills of Chianti, where the vineyards are like pages of musical notes. It's picnic country, a chance to get closer than ever to the flavor of Italy. All conversation becomes vital. The woods, orchards, and vineyards are the delights of Chianti country. Fertile valleys and rolling hills covered with chestnut and ilex trees, and the fields are purple with heather. It's a country almost too beautiful. One is always thinking, am I dreaming? The year was 1348. The plague had struck Florence and all Europe. It was frightful. Two people would be talking in the street and suddenly one would fall to the ground, never to rise again. People would avoid even their own families. Brother would avoid brother. Boccaccio tells the story of this famous plague in his Decameron. 7 young ladies heard Mass in the church of Santa Maria Novella, and after hearing Mass, they devised a plan to lessen their risk of infection by retiring with their servants to their country houses. Together with 3 gentlemen friends, they traveled from one villa to the next. At their villas, they would lounge about, sleeping late, having leisurely breakfasts, walking throughout the gardens, amusing themselves by telling stories. They invented a game where each of them would tell a story every day, and as they were there for 10 days, 100 stories were produced. These stories composed the Decameron, one of the great masterpieces of world literature. Boccaccio was one of the giants of literary Italy, along with his good friend Petrarch and Dante Alighieri. You are in the hills of Fiesole, and you will survive the plague, because you're in the cool, clean country air. Torre de Gallo is where Galileo worked out his experiments, the pendulum for his clock, and his telescope. The facade of the Cathedral of Florence is practically brand new, placed there in 1887. Filippo Brunelleschi gave Italy her first cupola. He worked for 14 years on the cupola, which would become the landmark of Florence for centuries. The lantern on the top was a design by Brunelleschi, but he died before finishing it. It was finished by his friend and student, Michelozzo. And on the very top is the orb, symbol of the church over the world, an old Byzantine symbol. 100 years before Brunelleschi did the cupola, Giotto di Bondone had erected the bell tower, or campanile. He gave his campanile 44 feet of foundation, so it's quite safe to climb to the top and look out over Florence. In 1401, there was a contest in Florence to find the right man to do the east doors of the baptistry. When the 34 judges saw the work being done by 5 of those sculptors, they eliminated them. Each contestant was given one panel to do in 1 year. It was a relief on the sacrifice of Isaac. Ghiberti won the commission. It was for the 10 panels on the east door of the baptistry, tales of the Old Testament. The doors were set in place opposite the entrance to the cathedral in 1424. When he started the work, he had a full head of hair. 25 years later, he looked like this, a self-portrait. He is now in his 50s. And this young man is about 13. He actually is around 2,500 years old. And this is how he really looked, a portrait. He's an Etruscan boy. The Etruscans, a mysterious people who lived right here in Tuscany. They gave the Romans their bronze and metallurgy. They invented portraiture and invented coinage. They gave the Romans their gods and their legends. The Chimera, the fire-breathing monster. It comes from a mountain in Asia Minor that belches methane gas and ignites on fire. It is a lion with a goat coming out of its back, with a snake coming out of its tail, biting the goat on the horn. The tombs of the Etruscans are all over Tuscany, and the number of burial grounds has not been determined. They revered their dead to the point of ancestor worship. Here is one style of tombs of the Etruscans. The dead were placed on top of the funerary urn in a feasting position. Their writing has not been fully deciphered. They were fine artists and knew good art when they saw it. It is found inside their tombs. Much of it comes from Attica in ancient Greece. They knew dancing and music and had literature. They produced scenes on cameos. Benvenuto Cellini tried to restore this one in gold. He only finished half of it. Here is Iphigenia, a daughter of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra of Mycenae. Mithridates was the worst enemy Rome ever knew next to Hannibal. And Hercule was Hercules, a hero and a god that is found in almost all the mythologies of ancient peoples. Perhaps you thought the safety pin was a relatively new invention. The gold fibula is well over 2,500 years old. It is from these ancient, sophisticated Etruscans that Tuscany derives its heritage. It says vini, wines, but it means much more than that. It means a pause in the workday, a snack, a chance to catch up on conversation, a break. That is not covered in garlic. It's choking in garlic. They scrape garlic onto fresh toast and pour pure olive oil on top. It's taken with a cold glass of white wine. For you professional photographers, I recommend you never accidentally photograph yourself. It just shows bad planning. Some say they use little garlic in Tuscany. Well, who are they trying to kid? There goes a whole bundle of garlic up through that window. 4 tons of garlic has arrived on a truck from Naples. Women come out to buy a month's supply. When they sell the load, they burn the truck. The smell is overwhelming. Even the dogs are turned off. During the Renaissance, the wealthy banking families of Florence built their palaces among all the poor neighborhoods of the city, never separating themselves from the people. They did not forget to place benches around the base of the palaces, so people would have a place to sit and talk. And no one loves a good talker more than the Italians. If you're a good talker, move to Italy. They'll support you for life. The Arno begins in the nearby mountains as a small stream. And as she makes her way toward the Mediterranean, she is joined by many tributaries. She quickly becomes a full river with many dangers for any city or town along her path. All you need is a slight rain squall in the hills and you can see her banks begin to rise. When she passes through Florence, she's only 3 feet deep. She has a rock bottom. She has nowhere to go but up. In 1966, she went over her banks and 15 feet in the air. She did the same thing in 1558 and 1333. She's a very dangerous river indeed. Uffizi means offices. They were the administrative offices of the Medici. Cosimo the Elder was Lorenzo the Magnificent's grandfather and a genius in establishing the banking systems that assured the inordinate wealth of the Medici family. He ruled Florence, but not only because of his wealth. He obtained even more power through diplomacy with the Florentine. Leonardo da Vinci lived at the same time as Michelangelo, although he was 23 years older. He could do it all. He was a man for all ages. Leonardo's Annunciation is among the many hundreds of masterpieces in the Uffizi galleries. Most of his inventions and discoveries were ignored or forgotten and had to be discovered all over again in following centuries. The collections of the Medici were turned over to the people of Florence in 1735 and are displayed here in the Uffizi. Leonardo trained with Verrocchio and was working in Florence at the same time as Sandro Botticelli, who gave us the birth of Venus. Venus was born in the Aegean Sea and was blown ashore by the winged zephyrs. The face of Venus is that of Simonetta, the sister of Amerigo Vespucci, who accidentally provided his name for a new world called America. The Medici archaeologists found this in Greece. There's a diaphanous effect in her gown. You can look through the material and see her leg. It is startling to realize that we are actually looking through marble, an effect that appears impossible to do, and yet the Greek sculptors of the Golden Age of Greece did it so skillfully. Michelangelo would study the muscle structure of the Greek wrestlers. For 50 years, the Medici ruled Florence unofficially. As long as Lorenzo the Magnificent lived, Florence was bright with optimism. Every day, something new and wonderful happened. Within 2 years of his death, Florence had become a somber city. A Dominican monk, Girolamo Savonarola, came out of his monastery in the hills of Fiesole and preached of imminent doom. He burned their vanities in the Piazza della Signoria. He defied Lorenzo the Magnificent. He turned the Florentine into many divergent factions, and then he went one step too far. He defied Pope Alexander VI. Both he and his disciples, Fra Domenico and Fra Silvestro, were hanged and burned down there where you see them feeding the pigeons, in Piazza della Signoria. The year was 1498. He had controlled the political life of Florence for 4 years. In 1565, Giorgio Vasari became the architect of the passaggio that connects the Palazzo Vecchio to the Pitti Palace across the Arno. It passes over the top of the Ponte Vecchio and leads through the streets to the Pitti. Cosimo I and his wife Eleonora of Toledo and their 8 children could hardly wait to change their residence from the Palazzo Vecchio to the new Pitti Palace built by her husband with her money. The building took just 3 years to build and was later to be the scene of the wedding of Marie de' Medici to Henry IV of France. It was for their wedding on October 6, 1600, that the first opera was performed. It was Eurydice by Jacopo Peri. Here we walk the long avenues of cypresses, ilex, and stone pine, lined with statues, many of them restored Roman works, and some of them carved in the 16th and 17th centuries. We owe this to Alfonso Parigi, the Younger, who planted it in 1637. At the bottom of the hill, we come to the Neptune fountain designed by Stoldo Lorenzi in 1565. It was the 8 children of Cosimo I and Eleonora of Toledo who were the first of many families of children to play here. They certainly must have loved it, being such a change from the dark, gloomy Palazzo Vecchio. Zeus, king of the gods, Jupiter to the Romans, looks out at the Florentine, who now use the Boboli Gardens for their noon picnics and enjoyment of the out-of-doors, fresh air and sandwiches of mortadella. Pegasus, the winged horse of the Muses. Venus, or Aphrodite, was the goddess of love, and her son was the little Eros, or Cupid. Zeus gave him his bow and arrow. As one wanders through the Boboli Gardens, mythology of the Greeks and Romans takes one far and away from the burdens of life in modern times. Florence has all of it. One simply walks the streets, and all of antiquity is illuminated and explained to the visitor. In no other city can so much of the highest levels of human achievement be displayed so lucidly. All the layers of culture are found in this city, beginning with the sophisticated Etruscans, through the Romans, into the Renaissance, and right up to the impeccable style of the modern, industrious Florentine of today. Florence is much more than a beautiful city. It is all things to the human spirit. It is a direct link to the soul. Cosimo I assured the safety of his family by placing a fortress at the top of the hill, calling it the Fort of St. George, also now called Forte di Belvedere. Julius Caesar commanded his engineers to find a suitable spot on the Arno to build a supply city for his campaigns in the north. They found the spot among a field of wild irises. They grow wild by the millions all over the hills of Florence. But these are not wild. These are blue bloods, flown here from all over the world to be planted and left to grow for 1 year. Then the judges arrive, judges from many countries. It's an iris growing contest. The symbol of Florence is the red lily. Perhaps the Romans thought the iris was a lily, but they're not even related. They just look identical to each other. The children come out of school to paint the flowers and show their work to their Italian teachers. Can you imagine what it must be like to be a child growing up in Florence and having the world's greatest art surrounding you, to inspire, to teach? Lucrezia di Tornabuoni was the mother of Lorenzo the Magnificent. There is a street named after her family, the Tornabuoni. All the fine shops of fashion are found on this street. The Palazzo Bartolini Salimbene is perhaps the best work of Baccio d'Agnolo. He gave it the style of Renaissance palaces of Rome. Florentine prefer Tuscan style, like here on the Palazzo Spiniferroni with its arches and impressive curving facade. The Via Tornabuoni begins on the Piazza di Trinità with its statue of Justice. Isn't it interesting? She represents justice and she has her back on the City Hall. Florence is like that. Symbolisms everywhere. Via de Tornabuoni, the Fifth Avenue of Florence. The elegant shops are here. The Giacosa is a swank pastry shop. Willpower and self-control is a must in there. Across the street is Gucci, Pucci, Ferragamo, and Valentino. This is a shopper's paradise. The ultimate in shopping possibilities. Italian craftsmanship manifests itself in hundreds of ways. But Italian shoes are one of the products of Italy that stands on its own reputation of superb quality and style. Men and women of fashion and taste prefer Italian shoes over any other, and the Via Tornabuoni has an abundance of choices. Why do Italian shoes stand out above the rest? Well, somehow they learned how to treat leather. Through so much experimentation, they now know the technique perfected to the apex of quality. People shop in Florence for leather goods, umbrellas, luggage, shoes, purses, handbags, linens, and silk. Here is a silk works that dates back to the 13th century. It is owned by an old aristocratic family of Florence, a family called Pucci. It's called Settificio Pucci, and they use the same techniques as the 13th century to tint and dye the silk threads. Why should they change? Nothing has been devised that is any better. Countries of Europe have always been sending their silk threads to Florence to be dyed. Rosella knots the silk threads together to make a bedspread for a very discerning client. She will knot 19,000 threads using a method that takes up to 5 years to learn. She sat there alongside of her mother learning these skills. When her mother retired, she took her place. And that is what's been going on here for hundreds of years. Jobs passed on from mother to daughter. Loretta works the 14th century loom. She will do 15 centimeters per day, which translates to 1 yard per week. This old silk works still uses machines for designing patterns that were invented by Leonardo da Vinci. Throughout Florence, you'll see on the palaces porches called loggia. The loggia was used by wealthy families for banquets and wedding parties. Dante Alighieri was to become an exile because of his politics. He never did return to the city of his birth. He wandered the country and found so many different dialects. Dante changed all that by giving the Italians one of the purest dialects called Tuscan, and that became the modern Italian language. Once a year, Dante looks down on the Piazza Santa Croce, where the Calcio Storica Fiorentino takes place on 3 separate weekends. 4 religious quarters of Florence fight it out. It all started with the ancient Romans. After the death of Alexander the Great, the Romans went off to conquer the Greeks. They found the Greeks playing a game in order to train and toughen their bodies for battle. The ancient Greeks were always fighting each other. The different city-states only stopped fighting among themselves long enough to fight Persians and attend the Olympic Games. The Romans brought the sport home to Italy, and the Florentine keep it going. It takes place on 3 separate weekends in the month of June. Here they come, 550 strong, the young nobles of Florence, descended from the noble families of the Renaissance. The semaphore dates back to when the ancient Roman legions would use them to send a message across a battleground. They could also send a message from signal towers spaced 1 mile apart down the Roman highways, an art form preserved for us by the Renaissance cities of Italy. The famous designer Emilio Pucci, the Marchesa, on his thoroughbred in dripping in gold brocade. The white team from the Church of Santo Spirito warming up on the left. The red team from the Church of Santa Maria Novella warming up on the far right. A game of the ancient Greeks, where the prize has always been a white ox. The salute to the mayor. This game, lasting 60 minutes, is carried out by 27 players on each team. The beginning of the game has the ball bearer throwing the ball from the center line of the camp. From that moment on, the players try with every possible trick to throw the ball into the net of their adversary in order to score a goal. They say that this game is a mixture of wrestling, rugby, and football. I guess you could also throw in boxing. It will toughen the body for battle, all right. But it's hard to imagine anyone surviving what you are about to see. Played in medieval costume by young nobles of Florence. Calcio Costume. The Italian Renaissance made its home in the city of Florence, and Florence has generously shared it with all the world.